The diner smelled of stale grease, burnt coffee, and impending violence. Evelina Blackthorn wiped the formica counter, her movements mechanical, but her eyes were sharp, darting toward the corner booth. He sat there, Evander Dawnhurst. Even in a ragged coat, he occupied the space like a storm trapped in a bottle. He was waiting for her, his queen, his fated mate, but she wasn't coming. The men in the black SUV outside were. Evelina's heart hammered against her ribs as she scribbled the words on the back of a receipt, her hand trembling. She wasn't a hero, she was nobody, but she couldn't watch a king die. She walked over, pouring the coffee. "On the house," she whispered, sliding the cup over the paper. The note lay beneath the ceramic rim. "Your mate sold you out. They're in position." Evander looked up, and for a second, the world stopped turning. The neon sign of the midnight griddle buzzed with an irritating, erratic hum, casting the interior in alternating shades of sickly pink and bruised purple. Outside, the snow was falling in thick, heavy sheets, silencing the highway, turning the world into a blank white page. Inside, it was warm, humid, and smelled of bacon fat and cheap disinfectant. Evelina Blackthorn adjusted her apron, the fabric rough against her waist. She was invisible here, a ghost in a uniform. That was how she survived. Being a lone wolf, a rogue with no pack and no lineage worth mentioning, meant blending into the background was not just a skill, it was a necessity. But tonight, blending in felt impossible, because he was here. Evander Dawnhurst, the Alpha King, the ruler of the Northern Territories. He wasn't wearing a crown or a tailored suit. He wore a heavy wool coat damp with melted snow, his dark hair plastered to his forehead. He looked exhausted. He looked human. But to Evelina's heightened senses, he felt like a standing wave of power, a low-frequency vibration that made the silverware rattle almost imperceptibly against the plates. He was staring at the door, checking his watch, waiting. Evelina knew who he was waiting for. Arabella Greyshore, the woman the tabloids called the Gem of the North, his fated mate, the one destined to stabilize his reign and unite the fractured clans. But Arabella wasn't coming. 10 minutes ago, 3 men had entered. They didn't order food. They ordered black coffee and sat in the booth farthest from the king, obscured by a decorative partition. They smelled of sulfur, gun oil, and silver. Mercenaries, witch hunters. Evelina had been refilling the sugar dispensers near them when she heard it. A whisper carried on a draft of air that a human ear would have missed. She said 11 p.m., no guards, just him. Payment clears when the head is in the box. Greyshore promised the perimeters down. The tray in Evelina's hand had tilted, just an inch. She had corrected it instantly, but the cold dread that washed over her was absolute. It wasn't just an assassination, it was a domestic coup. The queen-to-be was selling the king to the highest bidder. Now, at 10:58 p.m., Evelina stood behind the counter, the coffee pot heavy in her hand. She looked at Evander. He was sipping water, his eyes fixed on the snowy darkness outside the window, a look of tender expectation on his face. He loved her. The realization twisted a knife in Evelina's gut. He was a monster to some, a tyrant to others, but right now, he was just a man waiting for the woman he loved, unaware she had signed his death warrant. "Do nothing," her survival instinct screamed. "Walk away, go to the kitchen, hide in the freezer." If she intervened, she exposed herself. If she exposed herself, she was dead. Rogues didn't meddle in royal affairs. Evander checked his watch again. 10:59 p.m. The mercenaries in the back were shifting. One reached into his jacket. The scent of wolfsbane, acrid and bitter, began to drift through the air, masking the scent of the silver weapons. They were professionals. They would hit him before he could shift, before he could command the room. Evelina looked at the receipt pad in her pocket. She pulled out a pen. Her fingers felt numb. She wrote the words quickly, the ink bleeding slightly into the cheap paper. "Your mate sold you out. They're in position." She tore the slip free. It felt like holding a live grenade. She moved, not with the shuffling gait of a tired waitress, but with the fluid grace she usually kept hidden. She crossed the diner floor, the checkerboard tiles slick under her sneakers. She reached his table. He didn't look up. He was too focused on the door. "Coffee?" she asked. Her voice was steady, though her pulse was a drum in her ears. Evander glanced at her. His eyes were gold, molten, ancient, and terrifyingly intelligent. For a second, he saw her. Not the uniform, not the rogue status, but her. The intensity of his gaze almost made her drop the pot. "No," he said, his voice a deep rumble that vibrated in her chest. "I'm waiting for someone." "You need this," she said, her tone urgent, bordering on insolent. She placed the cup down hard. Coffee sloshed over the rim. She slid the folded receipt under the saucer, tapping it once with her index finger. "On the house," she breathed. She turned and walked away. She didn't run. Running attracted predators. She walked back to the counter, her back prickling as if targeted by a laser. She gripped the edge of the sink, counting the seconds. 1, 2, 3. Behind her, the sound of movement stopped. The silence in the diner shifted. It was no longer the silence of emptiness. It was the silence of a held breath before a scream. She risked a glance. Evander had the note in his hand. He wasn't looking at the door anymore. He was looking at the empty chair opposite him, the chair Arabella was meant to fill. His expression hadn't shifted into rage. It had shattered into a profound, hollow stillness. A king realizing his castle was built on sand. Then, the mercenary in the back booth stood up, a suppressed pistol raised. Evander didn't shift. He didn't roar. He simply flipped the heavy oak table onto its side with one hand, the movement faster than thought. Bullets slammed into the wood, sending splinters flying like shrapnel. The neon sign exploded in a shower of sparks and glass, plunging the diner into darkness. Chaos was not loud. That was the first thing Evelina noticed. In the movies, battle was a cacophony. In reality, it was sharp, punctuated sounds against a backdrop of ringing silence. Crack, a gunshot, thud, a body hitting a wall, crunch, bone giving way. Evelina ducked behind the counter, pressing her hands over her ears. The smell of wolfsbane was overpowering now, burning her nose. It was a gaseous grenade, meant to keep a shifter from turning into their wolf form. It forced them to fight as men. But Evander Dawnhurst was not just a man. A body flew over the counter, landing in the prep station with a wet crash. It was one of the mercenaries. His chest was caved in, not by a claw, but by a fist. "Move." The command wasn't shouted, it was growled directly into her ear. A hand gripped her upper arm, iron hard, searing hot. Evander hauled her up from the floor. "They have the exits rigged," he snarled, his eyes glowing fiercely in the gloom. "The kitchen, is there a back way?" "The loading dock," she gasped, stumbling as he pulled her. "Through the pantry. Go." He didn't shove her behind him. He pushed her forward, placing his body between her and the remaining attackers. He was using himself as the shield. Another shot rang out, and Evander jerked, a hiss escaping his teeth. A bloom of dark blood expanded on the shoulder of his wool coat. Silver. It had to be silver. "You're hit," she said, her voice trembling. "Walk, girl." They burst into the kitchen. It was freezing. The back door had been kicked open, letting the blizzard inside, but the exit was blocked. 2 more figures stood in the swirling snow, silhouettes against the headlights of the SUV. Evander didn't hesitate. He grabbed a heavy cast-iron skillet from the drying rack and hurled it with terrifying velocity. It struck the first figure in the head with a sickening clang. The man dropped. The second man raised a rifle. Evander roared, a sound that wasn't human, a sound that shook the pots hanging from the ceiling. He launched himself at the gunmen. They collided in the snow, a tangle of limbs and fury. Evelina stood frozen in the doorway. She could run. The forest was right there. She could disappear into the tree line, shift into her small gray wolf form, and vanish. He was the king. This was his war. But she looked at the note still clutched in his left hand. Even while fighting for his life, he hadn't dropped it. Your mate sold you out. He was fighting alone, betrayed by the person who was supposed to guard his soul. Evelina grabbed a boning knife from the magnetic strip on the wall. She wasn't a warrior. She was a survivor. But tonight, the lines blurred. The gunman had Evander pinned, pressing a silver knife toward the king's throat. The wolfsbane was making Evander sluggish, his strength failing. Evelina didn't roar. She didn't announce herself. She sprinted through the snow and drove the boning knife into the attacker's thigh. The man screamed, his grip loosening. Evander surged upward, headbutting the man with a force that cracked skull. The attacker rolled off, unconscious or dead in the snow. Evander scrambled up, chest heaving. He looked at the man, then at Evelina, then at the knife in her hand. Blood dripped from his shoulder, steaming in the cold air. "Why?" he rasped. "Later," she said, grabbing his uninjured arm. "More are coming. I can hear them on the highway. We have to move." My car? Rigged, she said immediately. If she sold you out, she gave them the keys. We walk. He hesitated, his pride battling his logic. He was a king. He didn't run, but he looked at the blood in the snow, his blood, and gave a sharp nod. Lead the way. They ran. The woods swallowed them. The snow was knee-deep, a heavy, wet quilt that made every step a struggle. The wind howled through the pines, a shrieking chorus that masked their footsteps but bit through their clothes. Evelina led him off the deer trails, moving toward the ridges where the terrain was too rough for vehicles. She knew these woods. She had hunted rabbits here when she was starving. She knew where the caves were. Evander was slowing down. The silver in his shoulder was poisoning him, burning through his veins like acid. He leaned heavily on her, his weight immense. "Leave me," he gritted out, stumbling over a root. "I'll hold them off." "Shut up," she snapped. "You die, and I did all this for nothing." "Who are you?" he asked, his voice slurring slightly. "Nobody. Nobody risks their life for a dead man. You're not dead yet." They reached the incline, a steep, rocky face hidden by a curtain of hemlock. Evelina shoved aside the branches, revealing a fissure in the rock face, a small cave, barely a crack in the earth. "In," she commanded. Evander collapsed inside, sliding down the cold stone wall. Evelina followed, dragging pine boughs over the entrance to obscure it. The darkness inside was absolute. The only sound was Evander's ragged breathing, wet, heavy, and slowing down. She fumbled in her pocket for a lighter she kept for customers who smoked. She flicked it. The small flame danced, illuminating the cave. Evander was pale, his skin graying. The wound on his shoulder was black and oozing. The silver was spreading. He looked at her, his golden eyes dimming, but still burning with a fierce, bewildered intelligence. "Arabella," he whispered. It wasn't a question. It was a plea for it to be a lie. Evelina knelt beside him, her heart breaking for the monster in the dark. She wasn't there, Evander. She sent them. He closed his eyes, and a single tear, hot and angry, tracked through the grime on his face. "Then let me die. There is nothing left." "No," Evelina said, reaching for his coat buttons. "The king might be dead, but the man has to survive. Hold still. I have to dig the silver out." Pain was a familiar country to Evander Dawnhurst. He had broken bones in training, suffered lacerations in border skirmishes, and endured the headache of politics. But the pain of silver was different. It wasn't just physical, it was spiritual. It severed the connection to the wolf. It made him feel small, mortal. But the pain of the knife digging into his shoulder was sharp, grounding him in the present. "Almost got it," the woman muttered. He opened his eyes. In the flickering light of a small fire she had managed to build, smokeless, fed by dry twigs, she looked like a spirit. Pale skin, dark hair pulled back in a messy knot, eyes the color of storm clouds. Evelina. He remembered her name tag. She had hands that were rough, calloused from work, but her touch was surprisingly gentle. She poured something over the wound, cheap whiskey from a flask she had produced from her pocket. He hissed, arching his back against the stone. "Sorry," she murmured, not sounding sorry at all. "Cauterizing isn't an option. The smoke would give us away. This has to do." She pressed a wad of clean cloth, strips torn from her apron, against the wound. "The bullet is out," she said, sitting back on her heels. She wiped her bloody hands on the snow near the entrance. "You'll heal, slowly, but you'll heal." Evander watched her. She was shivering. Her waitress uniform was thin, synthetic polyester, meant for a heated diner, not a blizzard in the Northern Territories. "Come here," he said. His voice was a wreck, gravel grinding on glass. She looked at him warily. "I'm fine. You're freezing, and I'm burning up with fever. It's simple thermodynamics, Evelina." She hesitated, then crawled closer. The space was small. She sat beside him, not touching. "Closer," he commanded softly. "I don't bite. Not tonight." She moved until her shoulder pressed against his uninjured side. The heat radiating off him was intense, a furnace fueled by his metabolic struggle against the silver. It soaked into her, chasing away the chill. "Why?" he asked again. It was the only question that mattered. Evelina stared into the small fire. "I heard them. In the booth. They talked about the perimeter being down, about the payment. I couldn't let it happen." "You don't know me," Evander said. The news calls me a tyrant, a warmonger. I know, she said. I also know that when old man Miller couldn't pay his heating bill last winter, a clerical error paid it for him. The check came from the palace. Evander blinked. That was supposed to be anonymous. Waitresses hear everything, Your Majesty. People think we're furniture. They talk. A silence stretched between them, heavy and strange. She sold me, Evander said, the words tasting like ash. Arabella, we were supposed to be fated. Were you? Evelina asked softly. Or did everyone just tell you that you looked good together? Evander frowned. He tried to summon the feeling of the mate bond, that magnetic, undeniable pull he was supposed to feel for Arabella. He felt fond of her. He admired her ambition. But had he ever felt the earth move? Had he ever felt that terrified, electric slide of destiny? No, he had felt duty. He looked at Evelina. She was hugging her knees, staring at the fire. A smudge of dirt was on her cheek. She smelled of cheap soap, stale coffee, and underneath that, something else. Something like rain on hot pavement, something like home. His wolf, buried deep under the suppression of the wolfsbane in silver, stirred. Just a twitch, an ear flick in the darkness of his soul. Interesting, the wolf whispered. Who are you, really? Evander asked. You fight with a knife. You track through snow. You cover your scent. I told you, I'm nobody. You're a rogue, she stiffened. Is that a crime? In your kingdom? Technically, yes. Unregistered wolves are considered a threat. Are you going to arrest me? She turned to him, her eyes flashing with a defiance that made his breath catch. I'm currently bleeding out in a cave while you keep me alive, Evander said dryly. I think I can grant a pardon. She let out a short, startled laugh. It was a beautiful sound, raspy and real. Damian Crestwood, Evander said suddenly. What? The man in the SUV, the one waiting outside. I saw his crest on the door panel before the lights went out. He's my general. If Arabella sold me out, she sold me to him. Evelina nodded. I heard the name Crestwood whispered. He wants the throne. He wants the power, Evander corrected. Arabella wants the crown, a perfect match. He laughed bitterly. They deserve each other. What will you do? Evander looked at his hand, the hand that had held the note. He clenched it into a fist. The fever was receding, replaced by a cold, crystalline clarity. The betrayal had burned away the soft parts of him, the parts that wanted to be a gentle husband. What was left was the king. I'm going to survive, he said. I'm going to heal, and then I'm going to go back. He turned his head, his face inches from hers. The proximity was dizzying. He could see the flecks of gray in her blue eyes. But I can't do it alone, he said. I have no army, I have no guard. I have a waitress with a stolen knife. Evelina held his gaze. She didn't flinch. You have the truth, she said. I need more than truth, Evander whispered. He reached out, his hand covering hers. His skin was rough, hot. I need a witness. I need a partner. The air in the cave grew thin. The fire popped, a sudden spark. I'm just a waitress, she whispered. You're the only thing in this world that is real, he replied. Outside, the wind howled, hunting for them. But inside, for the first time in his life, the Alpha King didn't feel like a ruler on a pedestal. He felt like a man who had just found something worth fighting for. Get some sleep, Evelina, he said, his voice dropping to a low rumble. At dawn, we hunt. She didn't pull her hand away. At dawn, she agreed. As Evander drifted into a restless sleep, he didn't dream of Arabella or the crown. He dreamed of the smell of rain and eyes the color of storm clouds watching over him in the dark. Dawn did not break. It bruised the horizon with shades of violent violet and gray. The storm had passed, leaving behind a silence so profound it felt like pressure against the eardrums. The world was buried under 3 feet of pristine, untouched snow. Evander woke to the smell of blood. Not his own, that scent was stale and metallic, but fresh, hot blood. He sat up, the movement stiff but no longer agonizing. The wolfsbane headache had receded to a dull throb behind his eyes. He looked toward the cave entrance. Evelina was there, crouching, skinning a snow hare with the same boning knife she had used to save his life. She looked different in the daylight. The diner uniform was hidden beneath an oversized flannel shirt she must have had in her backpack, but her hands were bare, red from the cold, working with efficient, brutal speed. You're awake, she said without looking up. Eat. We move in 10. She tossed a strip of raw meat toward him. Evander caught it reflexively. His wolf surfaced, hungry and desperate. He didn't hesitate. He ate the raw meat, feeling the protein hit his system like a jumpstart. It wasn't a meal fit for a king, but it was the best thing he had ever tasted. "You know how to hunt," he observed, watching her clean the knife with snow. "I know how to not starve," she corrected. She stood, brushing snow from her knees. "There's a difference. Hunting implies sport. This is just Tuesday for a rogue." Evander stood, testing his shoulder. It pulled, tight and sore, but the muscle held. "My healing is accelerating. By tonight, I'll be at 50%. "Good," Evelina said, shouldering a battered canvas backpack, "because 50% of an alpha is still better than 100% of a human." They set out. The terrain was unforgiving, steep ridges covered in ice-slicked granite, hidden by the treacherous powder. Evelina took the lead. She moved not like a soldier, marching in straight lines, but like water flowing around obstacles, choosing the path of least resistance. Evander watched her back. He was used to being the vanguard, the one breaking the trail. To follow was a foreign sensation, but he found himself trusting her instincts. She noticed things he missed, a snapped twig that indicated a bear's den, a shift in the wind that signaled a downdraft. By midday, the sun was high and blinding, reflecting off the snow with a glare that seared the eyes. They stopped near a frozen stream to drink, breaking the ice with rocks. "We need a plan," Evander said, wiping water from his chin. "We're walking north, toward the border." "Toward the Craglands," Evelina corrected. "The mercenaries will expect you to go south, toward the capital, or east to the Packlands. The Craglands are death. No one goes there." "So we're walking into death to avoid death?" "We're walking into my backyard," she said, her eyes scanning the tree line. "The Craglands are full of old mining tunnels, forgotten supply caches, and signals." "Signals?" "Radio towers, old tech. If you want to know what's happening in your kingdom without tripping digital surveillance, you need analog." Evander looked at her, really looked at her. The wind whipped a strand of dark hair across her face. She was small, unassuming, yet she possessed a grit that shamed his most decorated generals. "Why were you working at the diner, Evelina?" he asked softly. "You have skills that could have earned you a place in any pack guard." She stiffened, looking down at the frozen water. "Packs have rules, Evander. They have hierarchies. You kneel to the alpha, you bare your neck, you accept your place. I don't kneel." "You saved a king," he pointed out. "That's serving the hierarchy." She looked up, her gaze piercing. "I didn't save a king. I saved a man who was outnumbered 3-1. I don't like bullies, whether they wear crowns or tactical gear." Evander felt a strange warmth bloom in his chest, unrelated to the exertion. "I am not a bully, Evelina." "You're an alpha," she said, as if that explained everything. "Come on, we're losing light." As she turned, Evander caught a scent on the wind. It was faint, buried under the smell of pine and snow. But it was there. It was the scent of her fear, spiking suddenly. "Wait," he growled. He grabbed her arm, pulling her behind a cluster of boulders. "What?" she hissed. "Drone," he whispered, pointing up. High above, a black speck circled against the blue sky. It was silent, electric. A surveillance drone, Damian's tech. "They're gritting the forest," Evander murmured. "They know we didn't take the car." Evelina pressed her back against the cold stone, her shoulder touching his chest. He could feel her heart racing, a rapid, fluttering bird. "Can it see heat?" she asked. "Yes, thermal imaging." "Then we're glowing targets." "Not if we mask it." Evander looked at the stream. "The water, it's near freezing. It will hide our signatures." Evelina looked at the black icy water, then at him. "You want us to get in that? Do you want to live?" The drone was banking, turning for a lower sweep. Evelina didn't argue. She slid into the stream. The gasp she let out was strangled, her face turning white instantly. Evander followed, the cold hitting him like a physical blow, seizing his lungs. "Under the bank," he commanded through chattering teeth. They huddled under the overhang of the snowy bank, submerged to their necks in the glacial water. Evander wrapped his arm around her, not for romance, but to anchor her against the current. The drone buzzed overhead, a low, menacing hum. It hovered, its camera eye sweeping the riverbed. Evander felt Evelina trembling violently. Hypothermia would set in within minutes. He pushed his own heat outward, forcing his metabolism to burn faster, turning his body into a radiator. He pressed her tight against him. "Focus on me," he whispered into her hair. "Look at me." She looked up, her lips blue. "It's cold." "I know, just breathe, I've got you." For a moment, the war didn't exist. There was only the icy water, the drone overhead, and the woman in his arms. Her scent filled his nose, rain and ozone, and his wolf howled in recognition. It wasn't a polite greeting. It was a claim. Mine. The drone hovered for another 10 seconds, then banked away, continuing its grid search. "It's gone," Evander rasped. They scrambled out of the water, collapsing onto the snowy bank. The air hit them, freezing their wet clothes instantly. "We have to move," Evelina stammered, her teeth clacking. "Hypothermia? We have to find shelter, now." "The cabin," Evander said, pointing to a ridge a mile away. "I saw a roofline before we hid." "Run," she said. "We have to run." The cabin was a ruin, but it had 4 walls and a roof. It had been a ranger station once, decades ago, before the budget cuts. The windows were gone, boarded up with rotting plywood, and the door hung on one hinge. They burst inside, stumbling, their clothes frozen stiff like armor. "Fire," Evander commanded. His own hands were numb claws. Wood. There was a rusted pot-belly stove in the center of the room. Evelina, shaking so hard she could barely stand, kicked apart a rotting chair. She shoved the dry wood into the stove. Evander's lighter clicked. Once, twice, nothing. The flint was wet. "No," he growled, panic rising. "Give it to me," Evelina gasped. She took the lighter, blowing on the mechanism, warming it in her hands. She struck it, a spark, then a flame. She lit the dry moss she had pulled from the wall crevices. The fire caught. They stripped. There was no modesty in survival. Wet clothes were death. They peeled off the freezing layers, leaving them in a pile by the door. Evander stood in the dim light of the growing fire, wearing only his boxers. His body was a map of scars, claw marks, bullet wounds, the fresh, angry red welt on his shoulder. He was magnificent and terrifying, sheer muscle and power. Evelina turned away, wrapping herself in a dusty, moth-eaten blanket she found on a cot. She sat as close to the stove as she dared, her skin pale and goose-bumped. "You're still shivering," Evander said. His voice was returning to its deep, resonant timbre as he warmed up. "I'm fine," she stuttered. He walked over to her. He didn't ask. He sat behind her on the floor and pulled her back against his chest, wrapping the blanket around both of them. "Body heat," he murmured. "Don't fight it." She stiffened for a second, then melted. The heat radiating from him was incredible. It seeped into her bones, thawing the ice in her marrow. They sat in silence for a long time, the only sound the crackle of the burning chair legs and the wind howling outside. "Why Arabella?" Evelina asked quietly. The question hung in the smoky air. Evander rested his chin on the top of her head. "Politics. The Greyshore pack controls the shipping lanes. My advisors, they said a union would secure the economy. They said love grows with time. They lied." "They were wrong," he corrected. "I thought I could be the king they wanted. Practical, stoic, unfeeling. But you're not," she said. She turned in his arms, looking up at him. The firelight danced in his eyes, turning the gold to amber. "I saw you in the diner. You looked at that empty chair like it was the only thing in the world." "I was looking for a future," he said. "I wanted to believe I wasn't alone." He reached out, his hand cupping her cheek. His thumb traced the line of her jaw. His skin was rough, calloused, but his touch was reverent. "I'm not alone now," he whispered. The air between them changed. It thickened, charged with static. The smell of rain and ozone spiked, mixing with the scent of wood smoke and damp wool. Evander leaned in. His breath hitched. He was fighting a war inside himself, the instinct to claim her versus the terrifying reality of who she was. A nobody, a waitress, a rogue, and he was a king with a price on his head. "Evelina," he breathed. "Don't," she whispered, though she didn't pull away. "If you kiss me, Evander, you don't get to go back to being the king in the ivory tower. You don't get to pretend I'm just a waitress." "I don't want to go back," he said. "I want to burn the tower down." He kissed her. It wasn't gentle. It was desperate. It was the crash of 2 tectonic plates. It tasted of survival and fear, and a longing so deep it hurt. He groaned low in his throat, his hands tangling in her damp hair, pulling her closer until there was no space left between them. Evelina kissed him back with a ferocity that matched his own. For years she had been invisible, a ghost passing through life. But in his arms, she was solid. She was real. She was a queen without a crown. They broke apart, gasping, foreheads resting against each other. "You're my mate," Evander said. The words were a vow, heavy and absolute. "Not Arabella. You, the moon goddess, has a twisted sense of humor, hiding my soul in a roadside diner." "I'm a rogue, Evander," she reminded him, her voice trembling. "I have no name." "You have my name," he growled. "If we survive this, you have everything." If. The word hung there, sharp and cold. The morning brought clarity, and with it, the return of danger. The fire had burned down to ash. They dressed in their stiff, dry clothes, the intimacy of the night before lingering like a phantom limb. They didn't speak of the kiss or the declaration. There was no time. They needed to reach the craglands. They hiked for 3 hours, the terrain getting rockier, the trees thinning out. They were gaining elevation, moving toward the jagged peaks that marked the edge of the territory. "There," Evelina said, pointing to a rusted lattice tower on a distant peak. "The repeater station. If it still has power, we can listen." "And if it transmits?" Evander asked. "Then we can send a message to your loyalists." "I don't know who is loyal anymore," Evander admitted darkly. They began the ascent. It was grueling. The air was thin, and Evander's shoulder was throbbing again, a reminder that the silver poison wasn't fully gone. They were halfway up the slope when the shot rang out. It hit the rock inches from Evander's head, spraying stone dust into his eyes. "Down!" He tackled Evelina, rolling them behind a boulder as a second shot cracked through the air. "Snipers!" Evander roared. "High Ridge, 3 o'clock!" They were pinned. The shooter had the high ground. "They found us fast!" Evelina gasped, checking the magazine of the pistol she had taken from the mercenary at the diner. "How?" "The drone," Evander spat. "It must have tagged us before we hit the water, or they tracked the heat signature of the stove." "We can't stay here," she said. "They'll flank us." "I'll draw their fire," Evander said, his eyes beginning to glow. "You get to the tower." "No, that's suicide." "That's an order, Evelina." "I don't take orders," she shouted back. Before he could stop her, she moved. She didn't run away. She ran sideways, scrambling over the scree, keeping low, moving from rock to rock. She was drawing their fire. A bullet kicked up snow at her heels. Evander saw red. The rational, tactical part of his brain shut down. The wolf took the wheel. He didn't shift fully. It took too long, and the clothes would shred. He did something only the most powerful alphas could do. He partial shifted. His claws elongated, bursting through his gloves. His canines lengthened, his muscles swelled, ripping the seams of his flannel shirt. He roared, a sound that echoed off the canyon walls, terrifying and primal. He broke cover. He didn't run. He bounded, covering 20 feet in a single leap. He was a blur of violence moving up the slope. The sniper panicked. Evander saw the glint of the scope. He zigzagged, moving faster than human reflexes could track. He reached the sniper's nest. The man screamed as Evander tore the rifle from his hands and bent the barrel like a twig. With a backhand swipe, he sent the man flying into the rock wall. Silence fell. Evander stood there, chest heaving, claws dripping. He looked down the slope. Evelina was standing up, aiming her pistol at a second man who had tried to flank them. She fired. The man dropped, clutching his leg. "Clear," she called out, her voice steady, though her hands shook. Evander took a moment to breathe, forcing the wolf back down, retracting the claws. It was painful, like bones knitting together. He walked down to the second man, the one Evelina had shot. He was wearing the crest of the Royal Guard, a traitor. Evander grabbed him by the tactical vest, hauling him up. "Talk," Evander snarled, "or I let the lady finish the job." The man spat blood. "It doesn't matter. Dawnhurst, it's done." "What is done?" "The broadcast, this morning." The man laughed, a wet, gurgling sound. "You're dead, King Evander. Officially, killed in a tragic car accident caused by a rogue terrorist attack." Evander went cold. "And who is ruling?" "Regent Crestwood. He's already announced the wedding. He's marrying Arabella tonight to unite the grieving kingdom." Evander dropped the man. He fell back into the snow, unconscious. Evelina was beside him instantly. "Evander." "They stole it," he whispered. "My life, my name, my kingdom." "They stole a crown," Evelina said fiercely, grabbing his face with both hands. "They didn't steal you. You're standing right here." "I'm a ghost," he said, "a dead man walking." "Ghosts are dangerous," she said. "Ghosts haunt the living. Ghosts make them pay." She took his hand. "Come on, the tower. We need to hear it for ourselves." They climbed the rest of the way in grim silence. The repeater station was a rusted shack, but the equipment inside hummed with faint power. Evelina knew what she was doing. She bypassed the encryption, tuning the radio to the emergency frequency. The voice of the news anchor crackled through the static. "A nation in mourning. The funeral for King Evander will be held tomorrow. General Crestwood has vowed to hunt down the rogue faction responsible, calling for a purge of all unregistered wolves." Evelina looked at Evander. A purge. They weren't just killing the king, they were going to slaughter her people, the rogues, the outcasts, to solidify their power. Evander's face hardened. The despair vanished, replaced by a cold, calculating fury. He looked at the map on the wall of the shack, a map of the capital, of the palace tunnels. "They want a funeral," Evander said, his voice low and terrifying. "Let's give them one." He looked at Evelina. "Can you get us into the city?" She nodded. "I know the smugglers' routes. I can get us in. But Evander, it's just two of us, against an army." Evander picked up a radio handset. He looked at the frequency dial. "Not just two," he said. "You said this tower transmits?" "Yes." "Does it reach the gray zone, the rogue territories?" "It covers the whole north." Evander keyed the mic. He didn't use the royal codes. He didn't use the alpha voice. He spoke simply. "This is Evander Dawnhurst. I am not dead, but I have been betrayed." He looked at Evelina, his mate, his equal. "If you are tired of kneeling, if you are tired of the purge, meet me at the Iron Gate at midnight. We are taking the kingdom back." He released the button. The silence that followed was heavy. "Do you think anyone will come?" Evelina asked softly. Evander checked the pistol he had taken from the sniper. "We'll find out," he said. "Tonight, we end this." The capital city, Oakhaven, was a fortress of glass and steel nestled in the valley, glowing like a bed of embers against the night sky. But the Iron Gate, the old service entrance in the industrial district, was dark. It was a relic of an older time, a massive archway of rusted steel that marked the boundary between the shining city and the forgotten slums of the gray zone. Midnight was 5 minutes away. Evander and Evelina crouched on the roof of a derelict warehouse overlooking the gate. The wind was biting, carrying the scent of industrial exhaust and the faint sweet smell of the palace gardens miles away. "It's quiet," Evander murmured. He was cleaning the sniper rifle he had taken from the mountain. His movements were precise, but Evelina could see the tension in his jaw. "Too quiet." "They might be scared," Evelina said. She adjusted the strap of her backpack. "Rogues survive by staying hidden. You ask them to walk into the light." "I asked them to fight for their home," Evander corrected. "No," she said gently. "You ask them to fight for yours. You have to earn them, Evander." He looked at her, his golden eyes reflecting the distant city lights. "I thought I was fighting for everyone." "You were fighting for order. Rogues don't care about order. They care about freedom." The clock on the old factory tower began to toll. 1, 2. The deep, brassy sound rolled over the district. Evander stood up, slinging the rifle over his shoulder. "If no one comes, we go in alone. The sewer grate in Sector 4. "Evander." "We go alone, Evelina." They climbed down the fire escape, their boots silent on the rusted metal. They reached the street level. The iron gate loomed above them, locked and imposing. The street was empty, just swirling trash and shadows. Evander stared at the empty pavement. The weight of his failure pressed down on him. He had broadcast to the whole north, and the silence was his answer. He wasn't a king. He was just a man with a stolen gun. "Let's move," he said, his voice hollow. "Wait," Evelina whispered, her ears swiveled. "Listen." At first, it was just a low thrum, like a generator starting up deep underground. Then, it became distinct. Footsteps. Not the marching boots of soldiers, but the soft, padded tread of hunters. From the shadows of the alleyways they emerged. First, an old man leaning on a cane, his eyes milky with cataracts, but his scent sharp with power. Then, a young woman holding a tire iron, her her clothes stained with grease, then families, lone wolves, the unwanted, the broken. They poured out of the darkness like a rising tide, dozens, then hundreds. They didn't wear uniforms. They wore mechanics' jumpsuits, waitress aprons, torn jeans. They carried wrenches, hunting rifles, baseball bats, and old revolvers. They filled the street, a sea of silent, glowing eyes fixed on Evander. A woman stepped forward, Rosetta Mistwell, the unofficial matriarch of the Grey Zone. She was small, withered, but she carried herself with the dignity of the queen. "We heard the radio," Rosetta rasped. "We heard the king was dead." "The king is dead," Evander said, his voice projecting without shouting, filling the silence. He stepped into the center of the street. "The man who sat on the throne, who signed the papers that kept you in the dark, that man died in the snow." He reached out and took Evelina's hand, pulling her to his side. "I am what's left," Evander declared. "I am the one who was betrayed. I am the one who was hunted. And I am the one who's going to tear the throat out of the usurper." He looked at the crowd. "I cannot promise you safety. I cannot promise you gold. But I promise you this. If we win tonight, the walls come down. No more Grey Zone, no more unregistered. One pack." A low rumble started in the back of the crowd. It wasn't a cheer. It was a growl, a collective vibration of agreement. Rosetta nodded slowly. She reached into her coat and pulled out a heavy, rusted key. "The iron gate hasn't been opened in 50 years, she said, "but we never lost the key." She walked to the massive lock. With a groan of metal on metal, the mechanism turned. The crowd surged forward to push the heavy gates. With a shriek of rust, they swung open. The path to the city was clear. Evander looked at Evelina. "Ready?" "Always," she said, drawing her knife. "Then let's crash a wedding." The royal chapel was a cathedral of glass, designed to let the moonlight flood the altar. Tonight, it was filled with the elite of the northern territories. Alphas in tuxedos, Lunas in silk gowns, all murmuring in hushed, nervous tones. At the altar stood Damian Crestwood. He wore the regent's sash, a gold band across his chest. He looked triumphant, preening like a peacock. Beside him stood Arabella Greyshore. She wore white, but the dress looked like a shroud. Her face was pale, her expression unreadable. She held a bouquet of winter roses, their thorns stripped, but her grip was so tight her knuckles were white. The high priest raised his hands. "We gather here in a time of tragedy to forge a bond of hope, to unite the house of Greyshore and the regency." High above, in the ventilation shafts, Evelina crawled on her stomach. The metal was cold against her chest. Through the grate, she could see the ceremony below. The scent of incense and expensive perfume drifted up, sickeningly sweet. "I'm in position," she whispered into the headset they had looted from the guard tower. "Hold!" Evander's voice crackled in her ear. "Wait for the signal." Evander was on the ground floor. Disguised in the cloak of a temple guard he had incapacitated in the outer courtyard. He stood by the massive oak doors, head bowed, holding a ceremonial pike. He watched Damian, the man who had been his brother in arms, the man who had looked him in the eye and lied for years. Damian turned to Arabella. "Do you, Arabella, take this man to be your mate, to bind your pact to his in blood and spirit?" Arabella hesitated. Her eyes darted to the crowd, as if looking for a ghost. She started. Boom! The explosion didn't come from the chapel. It came from the power grid. The main transformer outside the palace walls detonated, courtesy of a well-placed Molotov cocktail thrown by the rogues. The lights in the cathedral died. Screams erupted. The only light came from the moonlight streaming through the glass ceiling. "Now!" Evander roared. He threw off the cloak. He didn't shift. There wasn't room. He used the pike. He spun it, slamming the blunt end into the chest of the nearest guard, sending him flying into the pews. "The king!" someone screamed. "It's the king!" Panic. Absolute chaos. The elite scrambled, overturning benches, trampling each other to get to the exits. But the exits were blocked. The rogues had infiltrated the perimeter. Evander marched down the aisle. He was a force of nature. Guards rushed him, Damian's personal elite. Evander didn't slow down. He fought with a brutal efficiency, disarming, striking, breaking bone. He was a conductor of violence. Damian stood at the altar, frozen. He stared at Evander as if looking at a demon rising from hell. "Impossible," Damian whispered. "I saw the report. You're dead." I got better, Evander snarled. He vaulted over the communion rail, landing on the dais. Damian drew his sword, a ceremonial blade but sharp enough. Kill him! Kill them all! Guards poured in from the sacristy. From the ceiling, glass shattered. Evelina dropped from the ventilation shaft, rappelling down on a cable she had rigged. She landed on the back of a guard who was aiming a crossbow at Evander. She drove her knife into the gap in his armor. She rolled to her feet, standing back to back with Evander. Fashionably late, she grinned, breathless. Traffic was murder, he replied. They moved as one. They had no telepathy, no bond ceremony, but they flowed like water. When Evander blocked high, Evelina struck low. When she feinted, he delivered the knockout blow. They were a whirlwind of steel and fury. Damian backed away, grabbing Arabella by the arm. Come on! Arabella yanked her arm free. She looked at Damian, then at Evander. Arabella, move! Damian shouted, raising his sword to strike Evander while his back was turned. No! Arabella screamed. She didn't run to Evander. She didn't attack Damian. She threw herself in front of the blow meant for the king. The sword sliced through silk and skin. Arabella gasped, collapsing onto the marble steps, blood blooming bright red on her white dress. The room froze. Damian stared at his blade, horrified. He hadn't meant to. She was his ticket to legitimacy. Evander turned. He saw Arabella fall. He saw the blood. The wolf didn't just surface, it exploded. Evander roared, a sound that shattered the stained glass windows. He didn't shift. He didn't need to. He launched himself at Damian, tackling him off the dais. They crashed into the stone floor. Evander punched him again and again. Each blow was a judgment for the betrayal, for the coup, for the woman bleeding on the steps. You wanted the crown? Evander screamed, his fist connecting with Damian's jaw. Take it! Take the weight of it! Damian spat teeth, laughing through a mouthful of blood. He fumbled for something in his pocket. A remote. If I die, Damian wheezed, the palace goes with me. The foundations are rigged. He held up a detonator. His thumb hovered over the button. Let me go, Damian spat, and I don't blow us all to hell? Evander froze, his fist raised. The rogues in the doorway lowered their weapons. Evelina stood by Arabella, applying pressure to the wound, but her eyes were on the detonator. Checkmate, Damian sneered. Evander's fist connected with Damian's jaw, once, twice, pulverizing the traitor's arrogance. But Damian laughed through a mouthful of blood, fumbling for a remote in his pocket. Get off! Damian wheezed, holding the device high. Or the palace goes with me. The foundations are rigged! Evander froze, his fist raised. Silence descended on the chapel. Damian scrambled back toward the secret exit, thumb hovering over the detonator. I'm taking the gold reserves. Anyone follows and boom. He glanced at the dying Arabella. Pity, you would have made a lovely widow. Arabella's eyes fluttered open, meeting Evelina's gaze. She whispered one word. Vase. Evelina saw it, a heavy golden vase near Damian's feet. She didn't hesitate. She hurled a silver candlestick, shattering the vase. Water and gold shards sprayed across the marble. Damian slipped. In that split second of lost balance, Evander shifted. The massive black wolf materialized in mid-air, jaws snapping around Damian's wrist. Crunch. The detonator skittered across the floor. Evelina dove, catching the device inches from the ground. The wolf shook Damian violently, throwing him against a pillar where he slumped, broken and unconscious. Evander shifted back, panting, and knelt beside Arabella. He promised peace, Arabella whispered, tears mixing with blood. I just wanted to save them. But I was wrong. She squeezed Evelina's hand. Make him a good king. With a final ragged breath, Arabella Greyshore was gone. Evander stood slowly, closing her eyes. He took the detonator from Evelina and crushed it in his hand. He then turned to the crowd, nobles, guards, and the army of rogues filling the doorway. This man wanted to rule by fear, Evander declared, pointing to Damian. But there is no weak, there is no strong, there is only the pack. He turned to Evelina, dropping to one knee before her in the center of the dais. Evelina Blackthorn, you saved my life and my soul. Will you stand with me? Not behind me, but beside me? Evelina looked at the shock on the nobles' faces and the pride in the rogues' eyes. She smiled, sharp and dangerous. Only if I get to keep my job at the diner. The tips are good. Evander laughed, pulling her into a kiss that sealed the new era. The crowd erupted, not in applause but in howls that rose through the shattered roof, a wild song for a kingdom without walls. 6 months later, the snow was melting. The first green shoots of spring were pushing through the thawing earth of the craglands. The Iron Gate was gone. Literally. Evander had ordered it melted down and reforged into a monument in the town square, a statue of a wolf and a woman back to back. The midnight griddle was busy. The neon sign had been fixed, though it still buzzed with that annoying hum. Evelina wiped the counter. She wore a silk blouse, tailored and expensive, but she still wore her apron over it. "Order up," she called out. Evander walked out of the kitchen. He was wearing a grease-stained t-shirt and jeans. He placed a plate of pancakes in front of Rosetta Mistwell. "Your Majesty," Rosetta cackled, poking the pancakes. "They're burnt." "They're caramelized," Evander argued, wiping his hands on a rag. "It's a culinary technique." "It's burnt," Rosetta insisted, but she ate them anyway. Evelina leaned against the counter, watching him. He was terrible at cooking, but he insisted on working a shift every Tuesday. He said it reminded him of what was real. The kingdom was changing. It was messy. The integration of the rogues was difficult. Old prejudices died hard. There were still skirmishes, still political arguments. But the fear was gone. The purge laws were ash. Evander walked over to her, wrapping his arms around her waist from behind. He rested his chin on her shoulder. "You smell like syrup," he murmured. "You smell like burnt batter," she teased. "I'm the king. I can decree that burnt batter is the new royal fragrance. You can try." He turned her around, his golden eyes warm and content. The shadows were gone. "Happy?" he asked. Evelina looked around the diner, at the humans, the shifters, the former nobles and the former street rats, all eating under the same roof. "We have work to do," she said. "We have a lifetime," he replied. He kissed her, sweet and slow, ignoring the wolf whistles from the truck drivers in the corner booth. Outside, the sun broke through the clouds, bathing the north in light. The winter was over. The pack was whole, and the Alpha King and the Waitress were just getting started. Evander and Evelina's story wasn't just about reclaiming a throne. It was about redefining what power means. They stripped away the titles, the crowns, and the walls to find that true leadership and true love is forged in the fire of survival. By embracing the nobody, the king became a somebody worth following. Their love bridged the gap between the palace and the pavement, proving that destiny isn't written in the stars, but on the back of a crumpled receipt in a roadside diner. Did this story make your heart race? If you loved Evander and Evelina's journey from the snowstorm to the throne, please like this story, share it with your fellow romance lovers, and subscribe for more tales of fated mates, dangerous secrets, and love that defies the odds.